Hello everybody, this video is entitled Area of Study for the Elements of War, Connecting the Dots. The purpose of this video is to bring together some of the things you've learnt around the elements of war and the case studies you'll use to explain these elements. A metaphor. You all know I like a metaphor. This is a cake. Now, in order for this cake to become a cake, a number of different elements of cake making, or ingredients, need to be brought together. Here are those ingredients. Why do I show you this metaphor? Well, this is what the elements of war are. On the bottom here, you see each of those elements or ingredients, and when they're brought together, they make a cake. And for us, war will be the same. So here, we have all of the ingredients, if you like, that make up a war. Now, we're not calling them ingredients, we're calling them the elements of war. And each one of them helps us build knowledge to understand war. You can see the 5 here. Let's look at each one individually. War is an element of state policy. The idea that states have actions they can take, and one of those actions is to go to war. So a state can have a policy of beginning a war. We know in the case of the US, they decided to use war as an instrument to achieve their policies in Iraq. And here you have 2 images of the US military making war against the state of Iraq. So just like in Area of Study 2, when we learnt about foreign policy instruments, different instruments that states can use to achieve their goals, war is one of those instruments. And it's von Clausewitz who tells us that war is just another tool, a political tool, available to the state to achieve its goals. Moving on to just war theory. If we're going to have wars, then we need to be able to explain these wars. And just war theory seeks to do this. It seeks to set some guidelines when war might be acceptable. Guidelines like last resort. The idea that only in the last possible situation should a state go to war. Justifications like just cause, meaning in self-defense, states can go to war. I use these 2 examples of just cause, so self-defense, and last resort, because these were the 2 justifications used by the US. They often referred to self-defense, defense from terrorism. And the George W. Bush speech we listened to in class talked about the US being under attack, the September 11 attacks, as you can say here, and potential future attacks by regimes like Iraq. Intervention and occupation is something that can happen during war. And so when one state becomes involved in another state's affairs, they are intervening. And there are always implications here for sovereignty. Often these interventions can also lead to occupation. In this case, a foreign state will occupy another state for a period of time. And again, with the US war in Iraq, we have an example of that. The US intervened by invading with 150,000 troops and the coalition of the willing. So they violated Iraqi sovereignty, they intervened in their affairs. After this intervention, they occupied, so they had an occupation. And in the case of the Iraq War, the occupation lasted about 8 years, and it also involved some political moves. So the occupation involved setting up the Coalition Provisional Authority, a temporary government led by an American. This was followed by an interim Iraqi government, again, a temporary government, this time led by an Iraqi, put in place by the Americans. Our next element of war is the notion of peacekeeping. So peacekeeping is one of these things that came out of World War II. The UN was set up, and as a part of the Charter, it established that peacekeeping was something that the UN could do to try and keep the peace in dangerous areas. Of course, we know with peacekeeping, a number of things have to happen. The UN Security Council has to authorize peacekeeping. We have to actually have countries willing to give up troops to a peacekeeping effort. And the state that is going to be affected by peacekeeping has to consent. In the case of Iraq, we didn't have peacekeepers. At no point did a UN peacekeeping mission make it through the UN Security Council. At no point was a UN peacekeeping mission deployed in Iraq. And we can explain this by looking at the opposition to the war in the Security Council. The French were very much against the notion of military involvement in Iraq. And so because they opposed military intervention, they were always going to oppose a peacekeeping force. Finally, we have this notion of prosecuting war crimes. So we accept that wars are going to happen. Prosecuting war crimes is about what we can do when we think certain crimes have taken place during war. And so we have institutions like International Criminal Court, which is set up to try and prosecute war criminals. And that court we know is a result of the Rome Statutes. Of course, if we think back to our first unit this year, we know there are some flaws with these kind of institutions. For one, states have to agree to take part. And so if a state hasn't signed up to the Rome Statute, it's highly unlikely they're going to participate with the International Criminal Court. And the US government is one such state which hasn't signed up to the Rome Statute. And our case study coming out of Iraq is that of Sergeant Wuterich. This was an American soldier who admitted to gunning down 14 Iraqi civilians. So he was in a firefight. 2 of his fellow fighters were killed, and he took out his anger by killing 14 Iraqi civilians in a small town. Now, because the US was not a signatory to the Rome Statutes, he was not prosecuted for these war crimes, and he's never served a day in prison. So whilst we have institutions that attempt to prosecute war crimes, we have to accept that these institutions are flawed or limited in their effectiveness because of the nature of the global political system. So each of these 5 war elements help us understand war, and we can use a conflict like the Iraq War to talk about how each of these war elements, what they look like in an actual conflict. When we're answering questions about elements of war, 2 things I'd like you to do. First thing is to set up a base. So the first thing I'd like your answer to talk about is to talk broadly about each of those elements. So if you have a question about just war theory, I'd like you to begin by telling me what just war theory is. It involves justifications for war. Some of these justifications include last resort and self-defense. Once you've set up that base, you can then start talking about specifics in Iraq. So just like everything we've done this year, we have to have some sort of example to back up our answer. But with these elements of war, let's start with a broad response to the question and then bring in your Iraq war example. I hope that's cleared up some of the confusion around elements of war and what they mean. The next video will summarize 3 other parts of our course of this interstate unit, interstate war, and that is causes of war, responses from global actors, and challenges to effective resolutions.